All right.
Okay.
Okay. So it's my honor to introduce our Social Value Matters 2020 guests that will launch day 3. They are Jed Emerson of Blended Value and Zita Cobb of the Shorefast Foundation and the Fogo Island Inn of Newfoundland. Well, Jed and Zita have had very, very different careers. They have one thing in common: a great impatience for anyone saying anything too nice about them. So I'm mindful that my introductions have to be kept incredibly short, otherwise one of them is going to leave. And so I'm on it. I'm on it. You got to just sit with me for 30 seconds. But I can't help thinking about a panel yesterday with 3 Indigenous leaders, Shannon Metatawabin, Carol Ann Hilton, and Clint Davis. We were reminded that we all stand on the shoulders of giants. This is very much the case here. In preparation for a different session, I was reading one of Jed's papers, thinking of how relevant and urgent the points he was making are, only to realize that he wrote the paper in 2005. And he started doing and writing and advocating for the world to think of all value, financial, social, environmental, value in all of its forms, as indivisible in the mid-90s. Dare I say the last century, Jed. And that work has and continues to be foundational and provocative for the social value, social finance, and impact investment movements around the world. And then there's Zita Cobb. She will tell you her own story, and she might tell you that the Fogo Island Inn was named one of the top 5 hotels in the world 2 months ago, along with the Ritz-Carlton in Indonesia and Waldorf Astoria in the Maldives, with 2 others. As you learn about Fogo's story, you'll come to appreciate this accomplishment in the context of a commitment to buy everything locally and to an unwavering commitment to social and environmental justice in every nail, every thread, and every morsel the inn offers to its guests at a mere what, Zita? Is it $1,500 a night?
Oh, you're so low on that, Stephanie. That was 10 years ago.
Okay, well, you'll correct me. There are giants and there are giants. What is extremely meaningful to me and to very many others is the ongoing and tireless efforts of these 2 giants to lift up and empower others in their work toward a vision of what our world could be and the work to be done to get us there. Jed and Zita, over to you.
Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be back with this great gathering of folks and to be in dialogue with Zita about our various paths and traditions. I'd like to start. This session is about community and wealth and I think context. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Manhattan in New York, which is the traditional tribal territories of the Munsee Lepai people. And we just want to call that out for our consideration, because at the end of the day, it's great to talk about finance, it's great to talk about accounting and metrics, but we have to drive all of this back to purpose, back to community. And in the conversation that I've had the pleasure of having with Zita has been all about kind of like her exploration of those ideas. And what was exciting for me to be in conversation with her is because in part our paths have been so different, it's just wonderful to hear somebody else describe their journey and their exploration and where all of this has brought them to where all of us are. That is, I think, to a recognition of the fact that we can't continue to split economics apart from social and environmental issues of consideration. And I would just like to start actually to get us going, Zita, if you could just really take a chunk of time here on the front end and just kind of unpack your story, how you evolved to where you are today and the things that have kind of influenced your thinking. And I think more importantly, your practice is how you kind of show up and how you're present in this field and in these areas of work. So I'll just turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jed. Well, most important thing, as my old boss used to say, the most important thing is to keep the most important thing the most important thing. And the most important thing is place, of course, because place holds nature and culture. And in that way, holds us all together. We are all, I think, the product of our life experiences. And I'm 62 years old, and I've lived in 3 centuries already, because I was born and raised as an 8th-generation Fogo Islander on Fogo Island, which is off the northeast coast of Newfoundland, far away from far away, which is the very eastern part of Canada. Until I was 10, I really lived in the 19th century because I was born into a family of fishing people. We were fishermen, fishers and sealers. We had no running water, no electricity, and my parents couldn't read and write. And we had very little contact with the mainland. And importantly to the conversation we're having today, there was no money. I mean, there simply wasn't a bank. We just fished and hunted and foraged and grew things, and we traded with merchants for the things that we didn't have or couldn't produce, like flour or clothing. And when I was 10, or just before I turned 10, the worst of the 20th century came down on top of us in the form of the industrialization of the fishery. We fished for cod. Cod is such an important part of the whole culture of Fogo Island and really of the whole province. We don't call cod in Newfoundland, we call it fish. Everything else is secondary. And these monster draggers started showing up well, we had a 12-mile fishing limit, Canada did at the time, but they were well inside that. It took no time at all to take practically every fish out of the ocean. So the life that we knew and the culture we had kind of collapsed overnight. And my father, whose name was Lambert, was one of these people who had a deep, deep ecological logic and a social logic. He lived in a tangle in this little community, 10 little communities on an island that's 4 times the size of Manhattan, about 300 square kilometers. We understood how to hold on. We understood how to hold on and get along together, or muck along together. Anyway, after finishing high school on the island, I went away to, as the older people would say, I went up to Canada. I came to Ottawa to study business. And my career was largely in technology. And I think about that as the 21st century. I've just described to you the 3rd century, which was for a company that was largely focused on wave division multiplexing, which are the little optical devices that basically enabled what we're doing here today. So those are the three centuries. And I see myself as always trying to reconcile the relationship between money and life. I'm going to give you a chance to jump in before I launch into what I've been doing more recently.
Well, so just by way of context setting then, how did, given the context of the economics of the island, how did people think about ownership? How do people think about the commons? How do they think about, what prevented, one of your neighbors on the other side of the island from coming in and simply fishing out some of these areas on their own? How did that all work? How did people think about that in this context?
Yeah, it was actually quite, a community, which, so within the Fogo Island context, there were 10 little communities. And this is important to our story of how we managed to hang on. 10 little communities. I grew up and lived in a community called Joe Bat's Arm. And the fishermen, because they were all fishermen at that time, certainly, each year when the season began, had various ways of sorting out among themselves who was going to fish where. And so depending on the time of year, we were using cod traps, which are attached to the shore. By the way, the Shore Fast, our organization is called Shore Fast because it's named for the rope or the tether that joins a traditional cod trap to the shore. So it's a metaphor for may we always be shore fast here in this place. So anyway, the fishermen had various ways of drawing lots for where they would put their cod traps. So you may have fished off of, Round Head last summer and you want to be off Bard Island Point next summer. So you would go out and in your boat and establish yourself on trap birthday, which was the 1st of June, where you want to fish. And if nobody else showed up at that moment to claim that spot, then it was yours. If several of us showed up, then we had to have a draw. But it got sorted out. And, you know, I don't believe the nonsense about the tragedy of the commons, because I grew up in a place that is a commons. And it's the same today. I mean, on Fogo Island today, where your house is, generally you own it, and not always, because, you know, we haven't been all that focused on land, cadastre, and all of these things. But everything behind your house up on the hills, that's a commons. That's where all the wild berries grow. We all pick berries. We all have our secret spots. And, you know, and it's not that we're not competitive about it, but just get up earlier.
Right. And then you spoke about the economics as being basically a barter and exchange system initially. And then obviously it's transitioned to what it is today, which we're going to go into, I think, in more detail, talking about the cooperative and whatnot. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, reflect with us around what was that like initially as alternative kind of demands began to rear themselves relative to how you were supposed to do economics on the island, those early days of that transition between centuries that you're describing.
We were part of what's called the truck system. I have no idea why it's called the truck system, but basically the people who live on Fogo Island today are descendants of mostly English and Irish people who arrived starting in the mid 1600s. and arrived with them from places like Poole, merchants who would operate a premises, and the merchants would take that. We were saltfish people or bacalao people. We salted and dried the fish and we traded it in the fall. These merchants were part of was a triangular trade. They would come over from England. They would go to the Caribbean first, bring to the Caribbean the fish that was from last year that perhaps wasn't highest quality, and they had plantations, and they had slaves that worked on these plantations. And so the Fogo Island fish went to the Caribbean, which is why today, and still today, one of the important dishes in Jamaica, for example, is saltfish and ackee. That's the Newfoundland cod or Newfoundland fish that came there. Then they would get salt in the Caribbean, come north, because even though we were saltfish people, Newfoundland doesn't really produce salt very readily. And then leave in the fall with the fish they traded with the Newfoundland fishermen and go back to England. And what we got in exchange was tea, flour, molasses, and some of the spices that came out from the Caribbean. So if you look at the food in Newfoundland today, is deeply influenced by that triangular trade. Now, I want to create the impression that this was just all peaches and roses, because it certainly wasn't. And there was a lot of mistrust between the fishing families and the merchants. The merchants, were de facto monopolists. And I'm sure there were, good ones and bad ones among the lot. So it was a bit of a tortured relationship. Fogo Island started to get more contact with the mainland. The first bank that arrived was actually a boat. It came as a boat. But in that sort of pivotal time in our history in the late 60s, when I was 10, the inshore fishery collapsed. And really that was the end of the merchant system. So not so long ago.
Right. And when those first settlers came to Fogo, were there permanent settlements of First Nations people, or were they just moving through the area on occasion, seasonally? I mean, how did that work?
There are many enormous tragedies with the Indigenous people in Canada, and and that are still ongoing and remain unresolved. Newfoundland is particularly acute in what happened because there were people called the Beothuk. Every last Beothuk person was killed because of encounters with the incoming settlers. The Beothuk people would come to Fogo Island in the summer and fish. They lived mostly on the mainland of Newfoundland, more on the interior, and so they would go back to. My father used to say they were so much smarter than us because we stay here all winter. They retreated into the center of Newfoundland, away from the winter winds. But so the Beothuk people were on the island, and I think the last Beothuk person died she died of TB. Where did she get that from? Of course, from the incoming people. She, I think, died around 1830, I want to say. There are still Indigenous people on the island of Newfoundland as well. More from the Mi'kmaq people are there on the west coast of Newfoundland, and there are some people, but no Beothuk.
Okay, so maybe we can circle back to the implications of that toward the end as we hear what happened next then in terms of the economics, and in particular the economics that you've been advancing through your work there. Do you want to tell us some more about that?
So everything, I mean, I think everything is made of something else. And I think that when you're doing good work, it's kind of made of the past somehow. It's like art is always in a conversation with what came before. So what I lived through as a 10-year-old, and really between 8 and 10, was the very real possibility that Fogo Island was going to be resettled, because the government of the province was faced with this enormous challenge of, tiny little, impossibly tiny communities all clinging to rocks all around this rugged coastline. Sometimes only, 50 people in a community, but they'd been there for centuries. No running water, no education, no healthcare, and suddenly no fish. And so the province decided really the only way around this is to resettle people. And so began this resettlement program that we still feel the pain of that in Newfoundlanders to this day. In a way, as the song says, people were moved, they moved without leaving, and they never arrived. I mean, this kind of rupture from roots. Fogo Island was super lucky because when we were faced with this, Fogo Islanders didn't want to go because, of course, we are an island, so we felt complete unto ourselves. Into this drama arrived the National Film Board of Canada and Memorial University, working together in a kind of investigative project to try and understand the causes of poverty. As a result of what is now called a Fogo process, and you can actually, if you look up the Fogo process online, you'll find a wealth of information about it, but it was basically a participatory film process that really looked into people's lives, asked real questions, and gave them the time in their own voices to answer. It really brought the 10 communities I talked about together, because before that, we didn't have a lot of social capital. There were a lot of religious differences because some of us were English Protestants and others were Irish Catholics. So this filmmaking process, not so much the products, although the products are lovely, they're 27 beautiful little films that are really like a guide to how to do community economic development. It brought the people together, and at a time there were still no fish, Fogo Islanders formed something which I just love the title of, the Fogo Island Improvement Committee. And so, well, there were a lot of things to improve. And out of that, they formed a cooperative. That cooperative celebrated its 50th anniversary a few years ago. It still owns the fishery on our island to this day. The 3 processing plants, we now, the biggest fishery is snow crab, and we fish for northern shrimp and turbot, and a small stewardship fishery because of cod are ever so slowly coming back. I just know this, if that co-op hadn't formed, we wouldn't be living on Fogo Island today. I wouldn't be here talking about what we've done. So when we started our work, and I'm talking about shore fast work, it was, 15 years ago, maybe. Seems, as they say, time flows, without moving. The idea we had was to put another leg on the economy, but to do it in a way that was going to strengthen place, strengthen culture, strengthen our ties with the past. And in a way, we think about it as Fogo process too, because we really did learn from what had happened 50 years ago. They're all, it's hard to, everyone's got a different word for things. I suppose you could say we were looking for a regenerative business model. It would be to, in other words, we were looking for a business model that made things better and went beyond just not breaking anything. If you think about the spectrum of business, in some cases where business is done in a way that's indifferent to place, any fool can turn nature into money. But how do you do, that's not actually real development. How do you do real development in a way that strengthens place and strengthens culture and strengthens heritage? And so we decided at the core of our work would be 2 things: art, because art is a way of knowing, it's critical thinking, and hospitality, because one of the things that has gone wrong in this world we're all kind of tangled up in of reductive consumerism is we've moved from relationships to transactions. Hospitality is about relationships. And so we built some studios, we worked with design. Design is such a powerful tool because it kind of works with nature, it works with art, design is a way well done that you can carry the things that matter and have meaning, of course, give them function, but also create aspirations. And so the first thing was we commissioned the artist studios. If you look at them online, they're like little jewel boxes, tiny little structures, contemporary architecture. The design brief for the architect for the studios and for the inn was actually quite simple. It was, please figure out how to express in contemporary architecture what we have learned in 400 years of clinging to this rock. And I think his name was Todd Saunders. I think he did a fantastic job. Once we had the studios built and the art, it's a residency-based art program. We publish, we have an art gallery, and we have something called Fogo Island Dialogues. Then we opened the inn in 2013. The inn has 29 rooms. We thought very deeply, we jokingly say it took us 7 years to argue about it and 3 years to build it, because it took a long time to figure out how. We were like detectives in our own lives, because there had been this rupture of culture because of the loss of the inshore fishery, which really our culture was derived from. So how do we hold hands with the past, bring forward their attitudes, their way of thinking, their values, build them into something contemporary that is, reaches forward? We think that we have to always think about ourselves and our work as a part of a bigger whole. And so it's always helpful to have a poem to keep you organized and oriented. And we do kind of orient in a poem by a New Zealand poet. I'm going to mess up his name, Glenn Colquhoun, I think is how you say it. But the poem, which I often misquote, and I'll probably do it again, is called The Art of Walking Upright. The art of walking upright is the art of using both feet. One is for holding on and one is for reaching out. So we were very focused on hold on to what we know, what we have here in this place that we love. We certainly practice asset-based community development, which I learned from John McKnight and his work in Chicago. And we reach out and belong to the world in a way that, we have some agency in that.
Right. And what were some of the tensions around executing those kind of ideas in practice? Did the government funders, did the investor community, did the foundation community, did people get it and say, oh, this makes sense, of course we'd want to be a part of that? Or was half the battle simply getting folks who were providing various types of resources to support the launch of this to understand what it was that you were even describing, much less what it was you wanted to do?
Yeah, I think, Jed, more than half the battle is seeing. Because once people see, then we can get things done. And for sure, if you were using classic reductionist eyes, economic reductionist eyes to look at Fogo Island, you would conclude it's a bald rock in the North Atlantic with some people hanging on and that have no future. Like, what's there? If you learn how to do asset-based community development and ask and answer the questions, well, what do we have? What do we know? What do we love? What do we miss? What can we do about it? You see, there's everything there. And as John McKnight says, nobody ever built a future based on what they don't know and don't have. And so it did take some time to convince our government partners that, well, first of all, we were committed. Everything starts with committing yourself. If you don't commit yourself, you just dabble, nothing ever gets done. And so you need to believe it, and then you see it, and then you commit yourself. In the beginning, there was a very famous letter we got back rejecting us and saying the project was, I can't remember, unreasonable, impractical, and irrational or something like that. And we thought, oh, good, that must be right, because it's not obvious. But to the great credit of the Canadian government and the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, they came on board with us. So we built, I took the money from my career, from my tech career, and being a sane person, I went home and I spent it. And I spent it to build these economic assets, which belong to the registered charity called Shorefast. So the beneficial owners are the people who live on Fogo Island. So then that's the business model, and it was meant to complement the co-op. So in some ways, Fogo Island is a hotbed of community ownership. And if there's anything I believe, it is that it really matters who owns what. And I know that you know a lot more about impact investing and how that's evolving. But I think I read something you said that impact investing, if you think about it as bridging the gap between how money operates and how money should operate, then I suppose you could say the money that went into creating the things we did in Fogo Island was a very classic kind of impact investing.
No, that's interesting. And then, so ownership is part of it, and obviously a critical part of it. Also, it seems to me, though, not everybody is going to own everything concurrently. So there's a place for stakeholder engagement, stakeholder voice. And I was thinking, you had described earlier the tensions between the different, the 10 different villages on the island and just the cultural differences. It seems that for a lot of us, as we think about advancing these kind of ideas on the ground in community, the sticky part is that seems to involve people. And so you end up spending a lot of time just trying to get everybody, on the same page, much less, moving in a similar direction. I wonder, could you talk about the stakeholder engagement process and stakeholder voice and what that looks like in this setting?
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. You use the word stickiness, and then the other word is friction. How do we end up in this mess we have created for ourselves in the world today? Part of the reason, I know it's a complex answer, but part of it is we prefer, we're a bit lazy, we humans, and we will seek a frictionless alternative if there is one. And that Jeff Bezos knows that for sure, if that man knows anything. Is that it's easy to draw us into that. And that's the community killer, right? Because, living in a community means committing yourself to, and I mean a tangible, physical, proximate community, committing yourself to a web of relationships with people that you don't always agree with, and they don't always agree with you, and you may not like them and they may not like you, but somehow you have to muck along together because you really have a shared fate, F-A-T-E. Not F-A-I-T-H. Recognizing that you have a shared fate and acting like you have a shared fate takes a huge amount of energy and commitment. And so I'd been away I always visited home because I'm a Newfoundlander and we always come home. But my career was away. And when I came back, I was neither from away nor from there. I was some kind of in-between creature. And when we started talking about this, and of course, remember, we're starting to talk about contemporary art and conceptual art in a community of people who are largely making a living from the sea. It seems like a big gulf. And there was a mayor at the time who was very helpful in guiding me. He was the one who connected me to John McKnight's work. And he said, this is going to move at a different pace than you're used to from your business world, and it needs to move at a different pace. And he also gave me a piece of advice, which I still use. He said, community economic development is the hardest work anybody will ever do, because everybody's a critic. His name was Freeman. Freeman said, even the dead people have opinions, and they're entitled to their opinions, and you're going to have to live with that. And so he said, so it's helpful to remember that you have two ears. And in one ear, you hear good things, and in the other ear, you're ever so slightly deaf. Because it's easy to become discouraged. But I also discovered that everything is kind of Gaussian. And so when we first started, probably 10% of the people thought this is the best thing they ever heard. And 10% of the people thought this is the worst thing I ever heard. And the other 80% thought, what does this have to do with me? Is this really going to happen? Remember, Newfoundland is a place where we cheat disappointment by not expecting anything. And so Freeman's advice was, focus on the 10% who understand what it is, want to get in the water with you and swim. And do your work. Do it at a good enough pace, slow enough pace, but not too slow, so that the other 80% see what's happening. And I think I suspect the 10% that thought it was the worst idea ever still think that. I just don't use it. I only have a limited amount of energy. And that's the biggest decision we all get to make every single day, is where you're going to put your energy.
Sure. So we've talked about, the broad vision of place. We've talked about resources and how we understand resources, differently in different points in time and context. We've talked about community ownership, representation, engagement. Those are all kind of broad kind of vision, strategy, almost qualitative elements of being present. And when we get down to the end of the day, you need to be able to prove that you've advanced the bar, that you've advanced forward, that you've done what it is that you said. I'm curious, we had spoken earlier in a separate conversation about the metrics that you use in your process, and the whole idea of accountability and accounting for this broader frame of performance and value that you're creating. And I wonder if you could walk us through that framework. And you had some slides that you shared earlier that I thought were very intriguing, and kind of move us toward this question of not only how do you track performance, but how do you become accountable to your stakeholder group and to larger communities outside of your own community. Could you just walk us through your thinking and practice around some of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think we all recognize now, we have this, however you express it, that there's Wall Street and Main Street, and there's a big gap. And that somehow, miraculously, the economy seems to be working, but community economies aren't working. And so how is this possible, and how do we reconcile this? And I think too many people have kind of given up, because this web of how money moves through the world and where it goes and whose pocket it ends up in it's almost impossible to understand. But I actually don't think it's impossible. And we have put a lot of effort into this. Our CFO is a woman named Diane Hodgins, and so she thinks of herself as a numerical linguist. And it's about, how do you make financial information available to somebody when they need it? Like in the moment of purchase is when they need it. And so we've been brainstorming about this for some time, but she did it. And so she created something which we've now trademarked, called an economic nutrition mark. And actually, I think if we can put it up on the screen, we might have a few of them that we can flip through. Okay, so this is the economic nutrition mark for the Fogo Island Inn. And as Stephanie said earlier, a stay at the Fogo Island Inn is not a small amount of money. But whether it's a small amount of money or a big amount of money, we think it's really important to tell you where the money goes. And so, don't know if you can, is this fuzzy? Can you see that, Jed?
I can see it, yes. It's a little fuzzy, but it's readable. So please continue.
So what Diane came up with, she said, food nutrition labels have become, well, they're now legislated, but most people wouldn't eat something without knowing what's in it. So we just copied the format of that. We always think, I don't know why we chose tea. Apparently there's absolutely nothing in tea. A tiny bit of sodium. In any event, we copied that format, and we simply tell you for a stay at the inn where the money goes. And this is on our website. You can see this, and we do it also for our furniture business, and I'll flip through. But in this case, we're looking at the inn, and we do the calculation at the end of each year. If you come back to the inn a little bit, just to make people who are driving crazy here, we show you that 49% of what you spend to stay at the inn goes to the people who work there. The typical hotel model that's closer to 30%. But we are aiming, the point of what we do is to create a dignified life for as many people as we can on Fogo Island, and to create a dignified experience for our guests. And so then 12% goes into room and supplies and a little bit into commission, and we target a 15% surplus or profit because we're a social business. And we don't always get it. In that particular year, we got 12%. And then the bottom part just tells you geographically, because the most important thing is place, where does the money go geographically? So in this case, I can't read it, but I think it's 63%, if I remember, of what you spend to stay at the inn stays on the island, and another whatever percent is that, 17% or something, goes into the rest of Newfoundland, and how much stays in Canada and where it goes. So we are very focused on every dollar we spend as well, where the money goes. Of course, when we built the inn, we made as much of what's inside of it, all the furniture, all the furnishings. The inn itself was made on the island. And if you now flip forward, we practice this same thing. We have a furniture business. And of course, we backed ourselves into a furniture business because we started by realizing one of the core sets of knowledge on Fogo Island is how to build boats. And boats are made of wood. And embedded in the building of boats is a deep knowledge about how and when to harvest wood. So it's about, as my dad used to say, nature knows everything. So if we pay attention, like nature actually understands this coronavirus. We're trying to learn from nature. And a boat builder on Fogo Island understands nature darn well and knows when is the right time to go, how do you work with the wood? How do you dry it properly? How do you turn it into a boat? And so we wanted to preserve that knowledge. We ended up making furniture, which is similar knowledge made more contemporary. Anyway, for this chair, we tell you that whatever you paid for it, 51% goes into to the people who made it, and how much goes into materials. And the same thing, 71% goes, stays on Fogo Island. And the next one is for, we have a fish, well, there is the Fogo Island Co-op, which is quite a large fish. I mean, it's one of the most important fisheries in Newfoundland and Labrador. But in addition to that, Shorefast Social Enterprises takes the cod in a handline program and brings it to restaurants up in Toronto and Ottawa. And this is 49% of it is just the product cost. And then of course we have to get it there and the marketing and all of that. 69% of this, what that we sell a fish for in Toronto or Ottawa goes back to Fogo Island. So I think of my father every time I look at this, because he could never understand why these monster ships would fish day and night. He used to say, it makes no sense that you do that. They're going to take all the fish. Before he died, he figured it out pretty much, because he said, I think they must be turning the fish into money. And in this new way of fishing for cod, because we take them one by one, we treat them with great care. We make sure that as much money as possible makes its way back to the people on the island. We think that we're turning money into fish. That's and money can do that. You just have to ask it. Tell it.
I love that. Yeah, I love that idea. And so how much of this was iterative and discovered on the way? And how much of this was yourself with a few other folks kind of sitting, I picture you somehow sitting in a small room with a wood burning stove with cups of coffee in the winter, kind of like saying, we got to get out of this shit. What are we doing? We got to do something here. Talk a little bit about like how much of this was strategic versus opportunistic versus simply discovery.
All of the above. And the only difference, everything you said is exactly right, except it was tea, not coffee. And there are a lot of wood fires. The Shorefast Foundation itself I set this up with two of my brothers. And the joke about that is I have a lot of brothers because it's Newfoundland family, but I only have two useful brothers. And so with the two useful brothers, Tony and Alan, we set up the foundation, and that really started a whole, well, what are we going to do? What should we do? I mean, one thing we could have done, which would have been a lot less work, is just take the money and put it into 2,500 little paper bags. That's how many Fogo Islanders there are, and just distribute it. But we thought what we really want to do is to create something we can all own together and that will outlive us. And so then I would say very early on, we settled, the idea was put another leg on the economy and make it complementary to the fishery and complementary and supportive of culture. But very early on, we settled on art and hospitality because we went through the process of ABCD. I mean, you don't need to be on Fogo Island very long to understand that this is a people that are profoundly hospitable. And we just didn't have a lovely inn, and we looked around the world and saw places that had community-based inns that strengthened culture. I mean, I think the whole travel industry, especially now in COVID times, is, in for a reckoning around, how they've contributed to a plague of the generic around the planet. And joy and knowledge is in the specific. So we were pretty committed to that. And I think the community was very committed to that, because an inn is it's like a Trojan horse in a way. It's a place to not just put ideas, but it's a place to put the things you love, the physical things you love, to give meaning to objects. I mean, objects can help us make meaning if we are aware of how they're made and out of what relationship they emerge. It's a way to cook and share food. And what is that? That's nothing more than a representation of place, of the creatures that swim in the ocean and the berries that grow on the land. And so it was a platform. So that was we thought, this is going to be, this is going to be done in a year. Like how hard can it be to build a little 29-room inn? Well, then it became this monster project because it was like we pulled a thread on a sweater and realized, there are other threads. And then we just followed the path that wanted to emerge. That was unbelievably productive and hard. Is the hardest thing I've ever done so far. And once you're on that, you have to absolutely commit to it because there's no stopping. And so it costs way more than we ever imagined. It took years and gave years to our lives. It just because it became a web of relationships. So I think it's a bit like the way, it's a bit like, I think how artists, when you listen to artists talk about their work, they may have an idea where they're going, but actually the work informs them.
Right. No, that's great. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'd like the participants who are participating in this to basically tee up questions that they may have. So I just want to kind of give that shout out. But let me ask this question first and give people a chance to populate the chat. So, as you know, I've written a lot about impact investing and, the process of using economics for change and all these things. And one of the things that I described in my last book, The Purpose of Capital, was the notion of mutual impact, that too often impact is something that we do to other people or that we do to the planet. We track kind of a decrease in carbon offsets, we track job creation, and we call that impact. And I would argue that in addition to those types of metrics, we have also almost a greater possibility to be transformed ourselves by the process of being engaged in these types of activities, and really to kind of grow beyond who we were at any one point in time to something more and greater with deeper meaning. I wonder, this is getting maybe a little personal, but you talked about the different kind of centuries you've been a part of, and you obviously personally have evolved as different people in different stages of the processes that you describe. I wonder if you could talk a little bit today about how do you see those transformations and who you are becoming as a result of the engagements, the relationships, the ability to maintain connectivity to place. How does that affect you personally, and how have you transformed? And what's the nature of mutual impact in your journey?
That's a big question. Jen, I think that, well, I've been at this on Fogo Island for 15 years. And for sure, I came to it with an arrogance that I think many people coming out of the business world have, because we think we're good at organizing resources and we got a bit of money and we can make this happen. And didn't take long being at home to be dissuaded of that. Now, I am the daughter of a man who every day pretty much told us, I don't care what you think. I don't care what you feel. I don't think he really meant that, but that's what he said. He said, I only care what you do, because it's only what you do that matters to anybody else. And so I am that person, but I'm very focused on action. And I discovered I had to dial that back, and I had to leave more space. I'm still not all that good at leaving space, but I'm better than I was 15 years ago for different people's actions to have a place in the world. It is really hard work to make something of all of us, and it requires us all to step back. I think I've read more poetry in the last 15 years than I ever read in all of the 45 before, because I find it helps me move from the physical to the abstract, because I think I need for me to move back, I have to move into the abstract world. Metaphor has been really helpful. So it's been a little bit about, managing my own energy to rush in and fill in all the spaces.
Right.
And,
right.
And I'm 62. When I'm dead and gone, who knows when that will be. This work exists that we've done on Fogo Island. And it needs to belong, and people need to feel it belongs to the Fogo Islanders that are there today and will be there tomorrow. I mean, they may choose to burn it down if they don't want it anymore, but it's, it's not mine.
Sure. No, that's great. So Kaz asks, at the outset of this process, how did you prioritize? How did you decide what was the most important thing that you would be kind of focusing on and advancing? And Kaz, if I misstated your question, please just clarify in the thing. But do you have a response to that idea?
Yeah, it really, Kaz, it was just place itself that we were optimizing for place. And if you make place the most important, then I always love the Schumacher sentence that nature and culture are the two great garments of human life. And so then what we focused on with a hyper focus was, what do we need to do in this moment, in the contemporary, that strengthens this place? That like really maybe part of our motivation, and my motivation is, I was angry. It makes me angry that we could have had generations. I mean, I think Folk Islanders, some of those families have been there for 10 generations. So you can have 10 generations of lived experience that's suddenly worthless. Like that tells you there's a broken relationship between intrinsic value and financial value. And so we were really motivated to say, what do we know? What is here? What is this culture? What is the attitude toward nature that's built in this culture? What is the attitude toward each other? And how do we build that into something that is an economic asset that fortifies that culture? And place holds all of that.
Right.
And the answers are always in the place. I mean, it's not that we don't reach out for professionals and professional skills outside, and we want absolutely to belong to the world. We do belong, but it's a way of using professional skills, whatever they are, whether they're architecture or design or accounting, to strengthen place.
So I know Stephanie is going to weigh in here in a second, but can I get one more? Can we continue this for a little bit? Okay. So place is critical. Places are centering kind of element, if you will. And we're confronted now, of course, with the product of what happens when you are disconnected from place. And when we think about COVID and the origins of COVID, at least in part, coming out of the destruction of habitat, our poor relation with the natural environment, with various animal species, and all of that then kind of laying the foundation for COVID. How do you frame that experience in contrast to what you're describing? And then more specifically, you've got a lodge that basically thrives on bringing people out into this new area, and with the hospitality and travel industries really imploding, what are your thoughts on how you're going to have to reposition yourselves, or what the implications of that will be?
Mm-hmm. I think with COVID, everybody went home and stayed home. So that's a good thing. I think we're all more acutely aware of place than we ever were before. I think it reminds us that that's places where your community is, and we all belong to networks. Like what we're doing today is a network that we all belong to, but networks should serve communities. And I think now that we are home, we start to realize that, wait a minute, our community is missing this and missing something else, or has this. And I'm a big fan of a book called The Third Pillar by a fellow named Rajan. And he said our societies rest on three pillars, and the pillars are governments, business, and communities. And we've come through 50 years of hollowing out communities, and nothing that any government or any business wants to achieve in terms of sustainability, to use a word I try not to use, is going to work unless it lands well in communities. And I think the travel business is in the midst of tectonic plates are shifting. I think that as travelers, we're more aware of our impacts, not just in terms of carbon because we're traveling, but impacts in communities. I think that time is really ripe for everybody who operates any kind of a hospitality establishment anywhere to think deeply about their relationship to the places they're in. Too many of them, as I said earlier, are just sucking money out of place. And I think there's a big opportunity there. I think when people start to travel again, and we are curious people and we are curious about each other, we'll be better at this travel business. And I think in a way, the time for the kind of business model that's in the Fogo Island Inn has arrived.
That's great. That's really great. I think, Stephanie, are we at the end of our time?
No, you're close, but you've got a little bit more time.
Okay, can I ask one more question then from the...
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Go, Zita. Ask Jed a question.
Jed, I'm always curious about, why do we call money capital instead of calling it money?
Because money refers more to the means of exchange, and capital refers more to flows of investment. So money is what's in my pocket that I give to you for something. Capital is the entity that I invest in the company that creates the cash flow that then gets, tiered off and put into the exchange process. And then obviously there's financial capital, there's natural capital, there's social capital, there's various elements of capital. But money to me, you can have monetary policy. Of course, you have M1, M2, M3, all that kind of stuff from an economics framework. But it actually, I think it's a really important point because money kind of moves and capital moves. But to me, money is often that transactive piece that you referred to earlier in the conversation, whereas capital should, to my mind, be more oriented toward value and value creation as opposed to purchasing and acquisition, I guess I'd say.
I need to talk to you more.
Well, we'll have to have one of those cups of tea at some point.
Yeah.
No, I think it's really fascinating because what we're describing here in this discussion really is a whole set of interlocking relationships. We're talking about the relationship in the physical community. We're talking about relationship of one idea to another. We're talking about the embedded nature of value that has elements of economic, social, and environmental aspects. We're talking about the narrative that connects us to each other, and how if that or as that falls apart, there's an inability of folks to be able to connect in order to advance the value that they're all, I believe, in their heart of hearts, wanting to create and to discover in their lives. And so what I really enjoy in terms of listening to you speak is you're concurrently kind of functioning at all these multiple levels. And it reminds me that that's really what this work is about for all of us, is that you can't, the metrics, the accounting, the documentation of impact are all key. And those are all parts of a much greater whole. And the reason we care about that is that they reflect elements of who we are and what we're trying to be about and create in the world together. And so I love listening to you talk about your story and your perspective and the experiences that you all have had there, because it's very powerful, and it makes me stop to think about how much in our current lives, so many of us kind of skate over community. And, we understand it and we know it's valuable, but because of the way, different lives evolve and because of the way current societies are structured, there's a lot of opportunity to disconnect and to be superficial in one's, on the one hand, acknowledging these things, and on the other hand, maintaining distance. So that you don't actually have to do X, Y, or Z. And the trick about the nature of community that you're describing is that you have to show up, you have to be present, and in doing that, you have to be accountable to each other and others. And so it's a very complex but beautiful set of fractals, really, that are kind of moving forward on a variety of levels through a variety of times. So
I think everything you said is exactly right. And we are always trying to orient. And no matter what work we do, I make the assumption that most people in the world, with the possible exception of one who I won't name, gets up in the morning and wants to do their best. But we get disoriented. And I think you working at different scales, when we talk about, okay, it's time for a poem because I can't sort this out, I'm too close to it, or that I can't sort this out by myself. I now need to go and into the tangle with others. But it's all working at different scales at different moments, and being able to zoom in, zoom out is really important.
Right.
Community is such a complicated thing, but it's such a simple thing. It's not something we have. Yes, it is, but you have it by doing it. It's something we do. And, and I said earlier, and I think we are fundamentally lazy. And so, if you think about how do we live together, how do we live our lives, how do we live together? It's all on a spectrum of one extreme feeling deep belonging, and then on the other extreme, deep freedom. Right. And where do you want to be at any point in time? And the thing about community is it demands of you. And when you're offered a steady diet of, nice things you can buy at a click or consume at a click. And, it just makes you feel good for a moment. It's very easy to be seduced into that because it sort of fortifies our laziness as opposed to getting off the couch and going out the door. I mean, I've given talks where people will say to me after, well, you're lucky because you live in a place that is a community. And I said, well, where do you live? Mars? You want to make a community? Go next door and introduce yourself. It just starts as simply as that.
Right. No, that's great. And then just as we're coming to the end here, one of the last questions was around what you're describing really are a set of complex adaptive systems where you've got these elements of interlocking, elements of process and creation. And the questioner was asking, to what degree are you looking to take some of the academic frameworks or lessons that people have created and bring those to bear, bring that into practice? Is that part of what you've had a chance to explore yet, or is that yet to come?
It has started because exactly that. And because we meet people from other communities that are, on their own journeys down to how they exist in the world. We are in the midst of something which we call a community economics pilot, where we are trying to distill what we've learned in our work and our learning into something that could almost be a guidebook. And we want to frame this pilot around, in fact, Rajan's thinking of the 3 pillars, because, the poem has to embody poetry. So if we're going to create, let's call it a network or a platform for community economies, for community economics, we need people from the policy world, from government. We need people from the business world, and we need people from the community world to actually get tangled up with each other. Because strangely, all of us individually have ideas around how to make things better. When we come together, sometimes we just get the same results. And it's like, why is that? And I think it's because we have the wrong architectures. We don't have a collaborative platform for that kind of a conversation. We need to grow one. We have institutions and processes that have outlived their usefulness, that were invented for the kind of economy that doesn't see stakeholders. And so therefore, I think we need to learn from Buckminster Fuller, and let's just grow a new one beside the old one that will replace it. So I know that's a wildly ambitious sounding thing for a smaller organization, but I think we can create a network for that kind of conversation, take what we're learning, take what other communities are learning, so that whether you're a business person, a policymaker, or someone deeply involved in community economic development, you can have the benefit of what we've all learned and are learning as a kind of guidebook to not necessarily do what we did, but how we did it is more important. It's the process.
Sure. No, that's great. Well, I this has been just a real pleasure to have a chance to hear about your story, your journey, the lessons that you've brought forward for all of us. So I really appreciate the time. And I know on behalf of the participants, I just want to thank you for what you're doing and your ability to share that so nicely with all of us. So thanks so much. And let me turn this back over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Jed. Pleasure.
I just also would like to invite Keith Taylor from Duca Credit Union, who would like very much to thank you on all of our behalf, the both of you. But I have to say, Jed, you never cease to keep us all on our toes, because you've made me wonder about 20 minutes ago whether or not you were needing help. And of course, you never need help. So here I am with my camera on. Everyone's wondering, what on earth is Stephanie doing? And I'm like, but I have to help, but you don't need my help. Neither of you, except that you're certainly quite an inspiring conversation. Keith, are you with us? I know I've seen you, so we're just waiting for you to come forward. Yeah.
I am with you. I just want to extend my thanks and thanks on behalf of the group to Zita for sharing that story, and for Jed for such facilitating such a thoughtful discussion. I love hearing the evolution of how these things come to take shape in communities. It's always such a reminder of the importance of not being able or not being afraid to just start and to go through a process and even if it's small, to begin with. The importance is just to start and to go back through that spectrum from transaction to relationship that Zita really framed really nicely. And it, if anything, I think it makes me realize that the work that we're endeavoring on at the Impact Lab is not only possible, but very attainable. So for me personally, I thought it was very inspirational and kind of filled me with some new energy as we go forward. We're at a much earlier stage of our journey than you are, and it's really interesting to hear the evolution, and there's a lot of lessons that we can take from that. If you're not familiar with Duca, just to add our history as an example, I think we're a really interesting case study as an institution about community and wealth creation as well. We were started, we're a $4 billion financial institution now, and we're the fastest growing credit union in Canada, which means we're a cooperatively owned financial institution, which means we're owned by the people that bank with us. But that wasn't, we had fairly humble beginnings. We were formed by a group of, a community in North York that didn't have access to banking and still needed to bank, so they created their own bank. And our initial iteration was actually run out of a living room bungalow in North York, and we've since become a $4 billion financial institution. And it's an interesting growth story in a number of ways. My work at the Impact Lab at Duca really spun out of that history in a lot of ways. It's when we started to go through the work of unpacking our own trajectory and our own history, the reason that people didn't have access to banking was that they weren't able to send the right signals to banks they'd be good banking customers. So if that was true then, that's probably true now. And as we got into the complicated work of having these discussions with different community groups and factors and demographics in the community that didn't feel particularly included in banking, we realized that we need to create space to come up with some better signals, at least some additional ones. So the Impact Lab's work is very much focused on that. It's about creating some space to really understand, what are some better signals, and ultimately, what would banking look like if all we were trying to do was create a model of banking that solved a problem or created an opportunity. So your journey is very, very closely related. It's one of the reasons I immediately gravitated towards this session when plans were coming together, and we're so thrilled to be able to support. And I was really enthralled in the conversation today. So it was great to be a fly on the wall, and I really appreciate the effort and the thoughtfulness.
Well, Keith, maybe you can come by boat to Fogo Island and bring different kind of banking.
Yeah, I would love to. My family's actually from the North Shore of Newfoundland as well, so I would love to go.